I was there, but I found it easier to write this in the third person. Nate, legal aid lawyer. During the first night of court hearings, the Central District was in pandemonium. Hundreds of defendants filled the old courtroom. Governor Agnew had set the curfew early, 7 p.m., and then proceeded to change it twice on the same day, to 6 and then to 4. In the midst of the disturbances, many people had been sitting on their stoops so as not to feel isolated inside their houses. They either had not heard about any of the curfews or were not clear when or what they were. Thousands were arrested, swept up off their own door stoops and loaded into vans to be transported downtown to jail. Nate was assigned to the Eastern District over on Edison Highway. The court and police station served the area where he worked and lived. Case after case came through with faces attached to the names, which he sometimes recognized, some of his legal aid clients or their family members, neighborhood workers from the Community Action Agency, his barber from the shop at Broadway and Oliver. Most were curfew violations with some allegations of petty looting. He challenged as many police officers as he could. Did they actually see the act or were they just bringing people in on hearsay? One defendant was being held without any charges. Nate pleaded with the presiding Judge Martin to let this defendant go if the police just couldn't come up with the charges. After 1.5 hours of Nate's pleading, the judge finally, reluctantly, agreed. At Central District, Nate's own landlord from East Baltimore came through. He had been one hell of a good landlord, a prince, charging Nate only a modest rent after giving the house's interior a fresh coat of paint. He, like so many others, had been swept off the streets by the Fort Bragg Army troops. The next day, Nate was treated to the antics of Judge Barker, usually a hanging judge in criminal cases. To his surprise, Barker seemed almost cowed by the proceedings. It was as if he had seen a communal reaction, when before he had only tried individual defendants, and he was scared shitless. As it turned out, there was no predictable relationship between the behavior of the municipal bench during regular times and during this period of civil disturbance. Judge Barker turned meek as a lamb, Judge Richards became tougher than usual, and Judge Kirk remained consistently a bastard. When Nate arrived at the Southeastern District Court the next morning, about 70 black men who had been on their way by city bus to the Bethlehem Steel plant at Sparrows Point were cooling their heels in the courtroom. Their bus would have arrived at the point just before 7 a.m., but since the curfew was to last until 7, the bus was stopped and they were all herded into the police station. The young prosecutor, tired of having been the bad guy the day before, now insisted on becoming Mr. Nice Guy by taking each of the 70 men one by one, lecturing him about the curfew and the need to obey it, and then letting him go. This little exercise in self-indulgence took over 2 hours. All the men were thus delayed and arrived unnecessarily late for work. Later, the prosecutor heard that his uncle's ghetto store had been looted and burned out. He became furious. Now he really wanted to stick it to somebody. That somebody materialized. A car full of blacks had been spied in a white section of town, Highland Town, and had been stopped because some men's clothing was hanging out of its closed trunk. When Nate went to meet them in the lockup, he could see that they were all keyed up. They may have been hopped up on something. In fact, they were so out of it that Nate was unable to elicit much useful information. He could see that he would not be able to prepare a proper defense for their cases at this time. They were charged with grand larceny for stealing $250 worth of men's clothes from a Highlandtown clothing store. The prosecutor salivated at this new prospect. Look, he told Nate, this is a real case. I want to try it so much I'll drop the charges down to petty larceny, okay? If convicted of grand larceny, these men could each face up to 15 years in prison. On petty larceny conviction, for stealing less than $100 worth of merchandise, the maximum sentence was only 18 months. Even that's a long time, Nate thought. I need to be able to do an investigation, prepare a good defense, and operate in a calmer atmosphere than this hysteria. No, I'm going to insist on getting a postponement so this case can be tried later on. The prosecutor blew up. He was beside himself. He wanted to try this case right now. Judge Donaldson came in for the night session. Uh-oh, Nate thought. In ordinary times, Donaldson can be a tough prosecutor's judge. I hope he is as unpredictable as the rest in these troubled times. It can only work in our favor. The two lawyers made their cases to the judge. Judge Donaldson granted Nate's request for postponement. The prosecutor wouldn't speak to Nate for the rest of the night. The case got handled 2 weeks later with the assistance of 3 lawyers, including Juanita Jackson Mitchell. The defendants were released on probation before verdict. A week after King had been killed, with most court hearings completed, Governor Agnew called a meeting of black community leaders. Nate heard on the news that Agnew's speech there turned out to be a shocker for those attending. Instead of seeking common ground to heal the wounds of the past 6 days, Agnew scolded Baltimore's middle-class black leaders for, quote, breaking and running, unquote, saying that you agreed among yourselves you would not openly criticize any black spokesman regardless of the content of his remarks. 4 minutes into the 20-minute speech, 80 of the 100 in attendance walked out in protest. Black leaders were furious. 4 months later, at the Republican National Presidential Convention in Miami, Governor Agnew would show the video recording of this speech as proof to other Southern delegations that he was Southern enough, an effective first stepping stone for his ascendancy to the vice presidency of the United States.